Our memory is divided into three parts: sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. First, there's our sensory memory. The brain sits in a quiet, dark space in the skull. Everything it knows about what is happening in the rest of the body and the outside world, it receives from the senses. Sensory memory acts as a kind of buffer for stimuli received through the five senses, which, by the way, are, can you name them? Okay, you have them? Yeah, sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. You got all those, didn't you? Yeah, I know. We are constantly being bombarded with stimuli from our five senses, and the brain has to somehow make sense of it. The way it does this is each sense provides a dedicated nerve connection to the brain. But what travels along these sensory nerves is fundamentally the same, regardless of its origin. The stream of electrical impulses traveling from the eyes would look the same as the signals coming from the ears, the nose, the taste buds, and the skin. The senses can only transmit signals. It is the brain's job to interpret them and build them into recognizable images, sounds, and so on. The second part is working memory. Working memory is like your dry erase board of life. It's where you do your work. If I gave you a phone number and told you to make a note of it, you would hold the phone number in your working memory while you would draw from your long-term memory to gather the information needed to complete the task. Working memory is the conscious memory we use when we're recalling newly received information, drawing existing information from our internal storage, or matching new information with existing information as we decide what to do with the new. Working memory plays an important role in memorization and also in thinking and decision making. But it has two limitations. First, it only holds information for a very short period of time, about 30 seconds. And second, it can only hold a limited amount of information. The most commonly quoted number is from Miller's research in 1956, which is 7 items of information plus or minus 2, although the newer research is suggesting the number is even lower. So for a really smart person like you, 9 items. For those less brilliant folks, a little bit lower, 5 maybe. Let's do a little test and see if we think this is true. I'm going to show you a number, and all you have to do is memorize it. I'm only going to show it for a very short period of time. So you ready? Oh, by the way, how many of you are like me and have already quit, saying, hey, I have an awful memory, I can't do this? Well, hey, you're by yourself. Just give it a go. You ready? Here we go. Okay, now you are holding that number in your working memory, and the likelihood is that you are also very quiet. And for some of you, your lips are moving a bit like this, because you're trying to repeat the number to yourself, to buy yourself another 30 seconds. And for a few of you, your eyes are doing this. Yeah, you're kind of looking upwards. This is because the central executive part of the prefrontal cortex at the front of your brain seems to play a fundamental role in working memory. It works as a temporary storage, but it also calls up information from elsewhere in the brain. So if you're ever on stage and the other actors' eyes start looking upwards, you know things are about to get really exciting because they've forgotten their lines and they're looking for them. In fact, forgetting your lines on stage is actually known as going up. And of course, I'm just wasting time while you're trying to remember the number because I'm that kind of guy. So, have you got it? Okay. On the count of 3, say it out loud. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Good. Okay, how'd it go? Here's one more number to memorize. You ready? Go. Good. Again, you're holding it in your working memory. Ready? Let's see if you can repeat this one. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Good. Was it easier? I'm sure a lot of you realized it was the same number. Here are the 2 numbers. The first number is too long to remember as a number, so you are forced to memorize it as 9 separate pieces of information, and thus working right at the outer limits of your working memory. The second number has been chunked into 3 pieces of information. In fact, if you did remember the first number correctly, it is most likely that you chunked it automatically by yourself and probably repeated the number back in chunks. Chunking is a simple memorization technique that helps to not overload the working memory. Oh, and one last thing to consider regarding the limitations of working memory is that if you want your audience to remember and apply your key messages, you must limit the number of key messages to 3 or 4. It's all we humans can handle. The third part of our memory is long-term memory. Long-term memory is super cool. It's like having a supercomputer in your own head. It has essentially unlimited storage and capacity. Think about that. I often take it for granted, but everything is in there. Everything. All the facts I know, all the experiences I've had, the people I've met, all the things I know how to do, and attached to them all are emotions and feelings. Everything is in there. However, the information is of no value if we can't recall it. A good storage system depends on good filing. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. The only way we can recall events and facts from our long-term memory is by cross-connections or associations. A story, or even a small part of a story, or for that matter, just the title. Think Little Red Riding Hood. They all create the perfect vehicle to stimulate endless cross-connections or associations. So when I have a conversation with friends, at maybe happy hour over dinner, the conversation will usually go along these kind of lines. I might say, I was just skiing in Winter Park last week and we had 20 inches of snow, and somebody will instantly interrupt me and say, oh, you know what? 2 weeks ago I was in Crested Butte and it dumped 30 inches of it. It was absolutely incredible. And then somebody else would interrupt and say, hey, do you remember, guys, when we were all, probably 2 years ago, we were all mountain biking in Crested Butte and Chris crashed his bike into the tree and wrecked it? And somebody else would be like, yeah, you had to go down to the town and buy a new bike from that little tiny bike store and pay like twice as much as he would ever have to pay in Denver. And somebody else would be like, oh, that's right. And remember, the only color that would actually fit his size was that weird purple color. And we call that good conversation. Now that I've mentioned this to you, you will probably notice people interrupting each other so they can tell their own story, happening all over the place. It's a bit like learning a new word and then hearing it 5 times the next week. So what's actually happening? Each fragment of a story triggers an association in another person's long-term memory. This new association is so overpowering that the person is compelled to interrupt and blurt out their newly recalled story. But why is the new information so compelling to us that it forces us to interrupt the existing conversation? Well, it's all about us. And we love it when things are about us. It's just who we are as animals. It's not bad or selfish. It's just how it is. We connect and learn best when the information received is meaningful to us. I'm sorry to say, but the listener is really not interested in your story, but they're really interested in their own story that has been triggered and released from their long-term memory. The good news is you don't have to worry about what story you share because it's not your story they're connecting to. And so any story will do as long as it's framed as a story. And you probably won't have to share much of it because you're going to be interrupted. And then it's a case of just shut up and listen. Your story is merely a prompt to allow your audience to connect to their own story. They will connect to you through their own story, but also because your story was the trigger that took them to the story. And you will also connect to their story through your own story. It's unavoidable. Now, of course, as relationships grow, more stories are shared and both sides will start to care for each other's stories. But even then, it's interesting to still see how it's impossible not to connect them back to your own stories. We love our stories. The beautiful thing is, as long as we are purposeful to integrate stories into all forms of our communication, connections happen automatically. And once you connect with someone, you are well on your way to successful communication.